Hello. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar on the ethics of artificial intelligence and machine learning. This is the third webinar in the Banking on Data, Great Possibilities, Great Responsibilities series co-hosted by the FDIC and Santa Clara University's Levy School of Business. This partnership brings together the financial, regulatory, and policy sector on the East Coast with the tech sector on the West Coast. The goal of the webinar series is to highlight and discuss the opportunities and challenges for financial institutions, consumers, and the financial system created by the use of big data and applied technologies. Each of our sessions provide an opportunity for all of us to engage with industry leaders, innovators, regulators, and academics to inform the strategies and policies that will guide us forward. We kicked off the series back in mid-April with two interesting academic research presentations exploring the possibilities of big and alternative data in finance and banking. Last month, we had our second session where FDIC Chief Innovation Officer Sultan Medji moderated an engaging panel discussion among industry experts on the use of big and alternative data to provide products and services. All of the webinar sessions are recorded, so I encourage each of you to visit our website to view the April and May events. Today, we are joined by Irina Raicu, who is the Director of Internet Ethics and Program at the Markula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. In her role, Irina addresses a wide variety of issues, including online privacy and data ethics, content moderation, the digital divide, and AI ethics. As we continue to explore the appropriate uses of AI ML tools and their impact on the banking industry, today's panel discussion will focus on policy and consumer impact perspectives on explainability, expectations versus reality, and bias. Before we get started, I would like to remind all participants to submit questions using the Q&A box on your screen. When submitting questions, please include your name and affiliation. All of the webinars are recorded, so today's video will be available for viewing on the event website within the next week. Also, be reminded that this is a 5-part webinar series, so please join us for future events. The final 2 sessions will explore open banking and how we can improve financial regulation in the world of big data. And now, I will turn the program over to Irina.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us. Before we get started, I just wanted to highlight the fact that other webinars in this series have already touched on ethical issues, such as data privacy and fairness and inclusion, and subsequent ones will as well. Today, though, we will focus on the ethical issues particularly associated with the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning in banking. These include privacy, but also fairness when it comes to access to banking services, as well as accuracy of evaluations, respect for human dignity and autonomy, and virtue ethics too, when we think about prudence and empathy in designing and deploying artificial intelligence and machine learning tools to this key context. Our 3 outstanding panelists bring diverse types of expertise and will help us look at issues such as the potential gap between expectations and reality, various types of bias, explainability, and more. At this point, I will just ask them to introduce themselves, and why don't we start with Patrice, please?
Thank you so much, Irina. And let me just take this opportunity to thank you, the FDIC, my hosts, Diane, Ebony, and Rebecca, and all of the great folks associated with this series. It's indeed an honor for me to join this distinguished panel. By way of introduction, I have the honor of serving as the founding and current Fair Lending Director at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where these issues related to the promise and the perils of innovation and algorithms and all of the new technologies are very much front and center for us in our considerations. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. And Nancy?
Echoing what Patrice just said, thank you all for including me on this panel. I think these are really important topics. I am a professor at UC Berkeley in the Haas School of Business. I run a research lab here. Our focus is primarily the mortgage market, and that will be part of my comments as I go forward. But I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. And Aaron, please.
Hi, like everyone else, thanks for having me here. This is a great panel. So I'm a computer science professor at the University of Pennsylvania and also an Amazon scholar at Amazon AWS. And I study machine learning and in particular privacy and fairness issues related to it. So I'm a mathematical computer scientist. I started my career thinking about differential privacy, if anyone's heard of that, and as issues of fairness have become more salient in the last decade, I've started working quite substantially on that as well.
Thank you very much to all of you. And I'm going to get this started by asking Nancy, first of all, but please, by the way, jump in, any of you, on any of the questions. Nancy, do banking industry users misunderstand the appropriate uses of artificial intelligence and machine learning tools, especially for decisions performed in banking?
So I think overall, especially for high-risk applications, the answer is no, they do not misunderstand. That there's an increased appreciation and understanding. And I think it's trickling down into the training of computer scientists, which as a professor, I see these students in the classroom and I see more appreciation of what the issues are. So for high-risk applications, I think there's a general understanding that good models need to provide predictive accuracy. And for high-risk applications in particular, the models need to be interpretable. And Aaron, I'm sure, is going to weigh in more strongly on some of these points, but the important features are that the model explanations have to be globally true, they have to address disparate impact, and they have to be robust to adverse actions. So I'm going to make 2 points related to this. One, strictly methodological in terms of what the tools for model interpretability are and how they're applied, and the tension there, and then mirror that in what the economics profession is increasingly worried about, and then what the law says. So the tension in computer science, as I see it, is the tension between intrinsic model interpretability, where you're looking at the basically inherent statistical properties of the model. Certainly in the markets that I work in, the mortgage markets, that's led to a heavy reliance on actually low performance models, such as logistic regression. But increasingly, there's a movement of the more high performance models, like rectified linear unit deep neural nets, which I think have a lot of potential. And I'm going to highlight that when I start to talk about the law. And then on the other side, there are the post hoc explainability tools that are using surrogates to understand feature importance. And of course, there have been evidence that the interpretation results aren't fully reliable. And so hence the tension between these two strategies. And of course, they intersect in important ways. But I think the broader question is determining whether the very rapid pace of adoption of AI and ML is leading to gains from that are evenly distributed across the US society. And since machine learning algorithms by design reduce predictive mean squared error, they are also by design going to produce predictions with greater variance. So from my vantage point, the key policy question here for banking is whether AI ML technology leads to more ethnic and racial discrimination in consumer markets. And that leads to an important point that's been made in economics actually back in the 70s, that improved prediction may reduce opportunities to risk share across agents and may therefore be welfare decreasing in society. And this is known as the Hirschleifer effect, and it's a well-known phenomenon that we see in many different areas, especially in insurance markets. So that gets us to the legal challenges, where I think the understanding in banking is a little less obvious and clear. And here the challenge is the implementation of the Civil Rights Act to determine what is legal statistical discrimination. And from that vantage point, starting from the Fair Housing Act, the consensus that is developing is that unintentional discrimination may be impermissible under disparate impact. So although lenders are allowed to use proxy variables that disparately impact borrowers of a protected group, the Fair Housing Act requires that these variables have what's called a legitimate business necessity. And the courts have very clearly defined what the definition of legitimate business necessity is. And that definition is practices that relate to creditworthiness. So that means that other objectives that, though they may be profit maximizing, such as differentially pricing consumers that don't shop, or charging higher rates in markets where you have clear monopoly power, that can't be justified, that lead to disparate impact and cannot be justified as legitimate business necessity because they are not associated purely with creditworthiness, which is the strict definition. So this leads to a more general challenge with algorithmic decision-making for bankers, is how do we police unintentional discrimination that arises from the use of redundant encoded proxy variables? And that is an important challenge. There's also still a tension in the courts themselves and how implementation of burden shifting frameworks for the determination of disparate impact are adjudicated. And here again, there's another tension, not terribly surprisingly, between the algorithmic fairness, in other words, the output from the application of the models is what should be fine-tuned. Unfortunately, that hasn't been supported in the courts because race can't be used to fine-tune an outcome. So that's a problem. So my colleagues and I have been working on what we're calling input-focused strategies. And these then start to rely on the post hoc explainability and the intrinsic model interpretability tools that are available to us. And so I think here that the importance is testing these targets and features to understand whether or not disparate impact has actually occurred and whether it's not allowable under the Fair Housing Act.
So Nancy has got us right into the details and also skipped us ahead a little bit to the discussion of bias and discrimination. I'm going to pull us back a little bit you've talked about the impact on consumers. I'm wondering also about the banking industry users who are deploying these tools and their sense of such tools as being able to potentially replace human decision making and lower labor costs. Do you feel like the banking industry users right now are overestimating the ability of such tools to take on these kind of tasks?
So here I think the answer is probably yes. I think after seeing the article about Amazon in the New York Times yesterday, scalability is a big issue here when you're using simply models. And obviously there's the tension between operational risk and efficiency gains. And as we use more and more variables for algorithmic profiling, I think it gets us back to fair lending. And so that tension still needs to be resolved. And what the risk is for firms is exposing them to civil litigation over the end results of their modeling. But I think there are other ways that they're overestimating. And 2 points there that it's naive these are reduced form models at their core. And so it's naive. So this is the Lucas critique, another Nobel laureate in economics, that it's naive to try to predict the effects of changes in economic policies entirely from observed historical data. And mostly these models are based on historical data. And so they explain the how of outcomes, but they don't really explain the why of outcomes. And there's risks there in terms of out of sample predictability and teaching to or underwriting to the model and losing predictability in the long run. And we learned that to our detriment in the great financial crisis. But I also think that the other problems have to do with the different uses of MI and machine learning in the various classes of models that are central to banks. Credit scoring models, stress testing models, and market models. They each have their different problems and risks. And I think the banks need to think much more carefully about customizing these tools to these three applications.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask Erin to sort of take us, even more to a 30,000-foot level and talk more broadly about, for people who are not very familiar with AI and ML tools, what are the limits of their potential right now? What can such tools achieve even under the best conditions available today?
Sure. So let me talk about, first of all, machine learning, which is the more technical term. Let me talk about its limitations generally, and then sort of as they relate to fairness and privacy. But the place I want to start is just that maybe machine learning is a powerful but very narrow technology, much more narrow than people, I think, generally think. So there's one thing that machine learning is good at. It is good at making predictions when the future looks just like the past and you have lots of data about the past. So there's nothing sort of qualitatively different about sort of machine learning compared to classical statistics. It's just producing more complicated models. And if you are in a scenario where you have lots of data labeled, so examples of people applying for loans, for example, together with whether they paid them back, then you can take this and you can make accurate predictions in the future about the same kinds of things if you are seeing exactly the same distribution of people. But it is very brittle, and so it can fail if, for example, the predictions made by the machine learning algorithm are used to actually take action, which will change the data that arrives. So for example, if the predictions used are going to set interest rates, which of course affects whether people are going to be able to pay them back, already you have already you've sort of deviated from the scenario in which machine learning works quite well, and this can sort of break its guarantees. If you are only gathering data in a way that is sort of censored by your actions. For example, you only see whether someone has paid back their loan if you've actually offered them a loan. Then this is something that can break the guarantees of machine learning unless you very carefully take this into account. And then the other thing I would just say at the outset as we start talking about things like fairness and privacy is that machine learning is essentially optimization on data, and it's going to do exactly what you tell it and no more and no less. So in particular, even if we are in a scenario in which, machine learning will sort of do what it is supposed to do very well, right? Make predictions. It is going to replicate, at best, it's going to replicate whatever structure is in the original data. So there's no reason to think that it will undo human bias that is in the data set because, for example, the loans that you have made in the past were made by human bankers, right? There's no reason to think that if you tell it, as is standard, to find a model that maniacally optimizes for predictive accuracy and nothing else, there's no reason to think that it will find a rule that spreads the mistakes that it will inevitably make uniformly across demographic groups. The burden of the mistakes made by the algorithm could be disproportionately borne by one group over another if you haven't carefully specified that you don't want that to happen. There's no reason to think that the models you learn, even though they are sort of statistical aggregates of the data set, will not include disclosive information about the people you used to train the models. There's no reason to think that just because these are statistical aggregates, statistical objects, that they are in any sense privacy preserving. Again, unless you take steps to address that. And we'll see if we talk about explainability more later. there's no reason to think they would be interpretable or explainable. So the last point I would make is that it's easy for us to talk in English about things like fairness and privacy and explainability, but in the end, these are mathematical objects. These are models that are trained through a process of mathematical optimization, and so it is very important when we start thinking at a technical level about fairness or privacy or explainability that we be very precise about what we mean. And there's scientific and practical progress in this direction, especially for privacy, but also for fairness. You can quantify different kinds of bias, and you can protect against these. I would say there's much less progress when it comes to explainability and interpretability. Before I can even think about evaluating whether some method that you have shown me that purports to offer explanations, you need to tell me what you mean by an explanation. What does it mean that an explanation is good? What is a good interpretation? And although there is a high volume literature on machine learning explainability, I think these basic questions have not been answered. So there are many papers that do something and say, haha, explainable, but there's little evidence that these methods are actually accomplishing anything in particular. Let me leave it there.
Nancy, did you want to jump back in on explainability, or should we move on?
No, I agree with what Erin was saying.
Great. Thank you. So Patrice, as you well know, and as Erin just mentioned, there's been a lot of concern that ML tools can codify explicit and implicit historical bias, especially in these key contexts related to banking. Can industry users take steps to identify and mitigate bias when applying these algorithms to loan decision making?
Yeah, that's a great question, Irina. And before I jump into the substance of responding to the question, I'd just like to take a moment, a point of personal privilege, to just say that it is particularly poignant to be talking about this topic about 2 hours before the President of the United States will sign legislation making June 19th a federal Independence Day holiday, an event that's really been 156 years in the making, when the final group of enslaved peoples in Texas learned of their freedom. And so it's particularly a poignant moment to be talking about the risks of encoding systemic structural racism in lending and in financial services. I'm going to ask my co-panelists if they wouldn't mind just going on mute, just because I'm getting a little bit of feedback. This technology is always challenging in these in these remote working times. Thank you so much. Irina, the question of bias, the issue of bias and innovation is a very important one. And as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, it's one where the Bureau and other financial services regulators are keenly focused. But I think it's important to note that the issue itself is not innovative or new. It's not unique. In fact, in the credit underwriting context, the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning actually reflect the continuing evolution of automated underwriting and credit score modeling, which itself was developed to streamline and ensure consistency in credit underwriting. And as with prior developments in the evolution of credit underwriting, including the advent of credit scoring, the use of AI ML models yet again raises the same perennial question around how to effectively leverage new technological developments in a manner that is consistent with fair lending and other applicable consumer protection laws. So not just the Fair Housing Act, as Nancy pointed out in her remarks, but also the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, where the Bureau's jurisdiction lies. When automated underwriting was first rolled out, it was widely believed that automated underwriting would eliminate fair lending concerns because it was a machine, not a person, making decisions. And I'm old enough to remember those days when those claims were made. But what we've learned since that time is that automated underwriting can drive discrimination, as bias can be unintentionally incorporated into the system. And so the use of AI ML models, in a sense, is like an upgrade of that machine. And it carries with it the same concerns as automated underwriting regarding bias and discrimination being unintentionally incorporated into the system. I'll just note that in terms of the legal paradigm and the legal lens through which we view these issues includes not only disparate impact, as Nancy pointed out, but also disparate treatment, because when variables function as proxies for prohibited bases, those can in fact be framed in a disparate treatment legal framework, in addition to disparate impact. As many of you may have seen, recently the 5 financial service regulatory agencies, so us and our sister agencies within the FFIEC, recently released a request for information on artificial intelligence. And in that RFI, we note that the use of AI models can heighten or create consumer protection risks. For example, concerns around explainability or how an AI approach uses inputs to produce outputs can create issues not only around safety and soundness of a particular AI ML system, which agencies like the FDIC and the other prudential regulators focus on, but they can also inhibit independent review and audit efforts, and closer to the Bureau's mission, make compliance with laws and regulations, including consumer protection requirements, more challenging. And so that relates to the models, but in addition to the models, the data being used in AI ML systems also play a particularly important role. In many cases, AI algorithms identify patterns and correlations in training data without human context or intervention. And then that information is used to generate predictions or categorizations, as Aaron pointed out in his remarks. But because the AI algorithm is dependent upon the training data, an AI system generally reflects any limitations of that data set. As a result, as with other systems, AI may perpetuate or even amplify bias or inaccuracies inherent in the training data, or make incorrect predictions if that data set is incomplete or non-comprehensive. So those are some of the themes that we echoed in this request for information. I'll just note that we extended the comment deadline to July 1st at the request of a number of stakeholders who do intend to provide us with some robust comments. And since there is time remaining with regard to this RFI, I just wanted to take a moment to encourage all interested stakeholders to please submit feedback on this important topic for us and our 4 sister agencies. Let me also just note, in response to the question about what steps industry can take, is to note that as this machine is updated with the progression of time and technology, it's also important that institutions take the time to update their compliance management systems that are attendant to these machine learning systems. As such, how to establish internal standards and controls to address explainability, interpretability, and other aspects of transparency are key questions for institutions. There are different ways to potentially accomplish these objectives, but they should all promote effective and efficient functioning of the AI/ML approach, as well as compliance with relevant laws and regulations, including fair lending laws. The CFPB has noted in the past that a well-designed fair lending compliance management program provides for a thorough analysis of relevant consumer protection laws and regulations to ensure that institutions understand the opportunities, risks, and compliance requirements before using alternative data and modeling techniques. And then based on those analyses, data and modeling techniques that present greater consumer protection risks warrant more robust compliance management. And that robust compliance management includes appropriate testing, monitoring, and controls to ensure that consumer protection risks are understood and addressed. And I'll also note something that's often overlooked in this field, particularly a field that is predominated by sometimes non-diverse teams, is that the diversity and inclusion of the staff and leaders that are involved in these decisions, in these assessments, and these analyses can actually strengthen a compliance management program. Many of us recognize that in diversity and inclusion are, in fact, business strengths in any institution, and a diverse and inclusive group of staff may be more likely to recognize both the benefits as well as the risks of AI/ML models. Thank you.
Thank you. So I would add that some of the earlier webinars in this series address the new kinds of data that are being now used and applied in the banking context in an effort to increase access to banking to people who would not have been seen under the certain kinds of data collected before. But they also open up, new avenues for introducing bias and new concerns about privacy. So I'm going to ask Aaron, can you talk from the technologist's point of view? What are the kind of things that users can do to, in terms of mitigating efforts when it comes to bias, everything from data collection to algorithm design to modes of deploying such tools?
Sure. And sort of there can and should be interventions at all of these steps. And as a general rule of thumb, fixing problems earlier in the pipeline is more effective and easier than fixing them later in the pipeline. So, as a couple of panelists have pointed out, machine learning is data driven, and so sort of inherently, machine learning algorithms make more accurate predictions in scenarios in which they have more data. And so sort of the first place that sort of problems can creep in when it comes to demographic bias is that your training data is simply not representative, right? If there's a demographic group that is not well represented in the training data, it is a very safe prediction that the model that results from training downstream will have high error on that population, and it can be high error in the harmful direction. So in every scenario, oftentimes there are mistakes that are more harmful for the downstream individual than others. So in a lending scenario, it might correspond to failing to give a loan to a creditworthy individual, so a false negative. In criminal justice settings, incarcerating someone who shouldn't be, a false positive, are sort of mistakes in the harmful directions. And at the data gathering stage, it is important to be mindful about gathering a diverse data set. And let me just point out that this can be harder than it sounds, right? So just to sort of use race and gender as two sort of common protected variables, you might want that your model should not disproportionately make higher error as a function of race, so say on white people and black people, or as a function of gender, say on men and women. But that, even if you succeed in that, right, that does not mean that the algorithm will not have disproportionately high error on intersectional groups, for example, black women compared to white men. And so when you're gathering the data, it's important not just to sort of make sure you have sort of representation in these sort of marginal categories, but also in these intersectional categories. Now, you're not done there, right? Just because you have a representative data set, that does not guarantee that when you train a model that you will not get one that disproportionately makes higher error rates, for example, on one group over another, right? So the way machine learning works is you specify some objective function, some way in which you're going to evaluate how good the model is. Oftentimes, it's just some proxy for raw classification error, like on what fraction of people do I make mistaken predictions. And then you run a training algorithm that, ignoring the details, is basically just automatically searching through some enormous family of statistical models to find the one that performs the best according to whatever narrow objective function you've specified. And there might be things that seem like common sense to you that the computer will entirely ignore if they were not specified in the objective function, right? So if it is possible to squeeze out just sort of a little bit more predictive accuracy at the expense of making many more errors on a small demographic group, that's exactly what the algorithm is going to do. And by the way, that happens, right? Like if you have two different groups that have different statistical properties, right? So let's say we're trying to train a machine learning algorithm to do like college admissions, and we're trying to predict from things like high school classes whether someone will do well in college. Well, someone who's gone to a fancy, well-resourced high school with lots of AP classes available, for that population, it might be that the number of AP classes you've taken is highly predictive of college success. But of course, for a population that's gone to high schools that don't have such classes available, those will not be predictive variables. Now, if one of these populations is big and the other population is small, by definition, the small population, the minority population, contributes less to average error, right? Because average error is just averaging over everybody. The bigger population contributes more to that. And so the standard machine learning, the standard thing to do in machine learning, which is to find the model that minimizes average error, Well, if the best model is different for the majority population and for the minority population, what this naturally does is it will find a model that fits the majority population at the expense of the minority population, not for any sort of reason that would be sort of familiar from thinking about the sources of human bias, but just because majorities contribute more to averages than minorities. And so just because you've got a diverse population in your training data does not mean that if you solve one of these standard optimization problems, you will get a tool that works equally well for people from different demographic groups. And so in the training stage as well, you have to first think about what exactly are the harms of the statistical model you're trying to avoid. Again, this will be different in a context by context setting, but in a lending setting where maybe the harmful decisions are the false negatives, the sort of creditworthy people who were not granted loans, you might want to add as an explicit constraint that the false negative rate, the rate at which the model makes mistakes in these harmful decisions, sorry, in these harmful directions, is not too much larger on any demographic group than any other. You don't want the harms of the algorithm to be borne disproportionately by one subset of the population over another. And that's something you have to explicitly constrain for, explicitly ask for in the training process, because again, computers do exactly what you tell them, nothing more and nothing less. You have to tell them what you want. So maybe I'll end there, but the answer is you want to act early. So it's important to get representative data, but that's not enough. You also need to constrain the training process, and in order to do that, you need to specify precisely what you want to measure to evaluate fairness in your application.
So I think it's very clear based on the whole conversation that it's much harder to optimize for human dignity or to optimize for a fair society than to just look at average error rates, as you were saying. And that's the challenge that's facing everybody here. Nancy, are there additional steps that you might suggest that regulators could take to identify and address bias or prevent the deployment of bias tools before they can cause harm?
So I think the comments just made are attending to both of the risks that we're pointing out, certainly the problems with the training data sets, even on vast data sets with tens of millions of observations, you're going to have problems with minority representation and geographic cuts of the data that make it difficult to fit for certain characteristics, and oftentimes the models err very significantly in terms of getting false negatives for populations that you do not want to score out of credit. So I think the regulators need to continue to take the proxy problem very seriously and the training data problem very seriously. But I'm going to talk about something else that I think is really important that actually is the same problem that we had post the Great Financial Crisis, and that has to do with governance of these models within the institutions themselves. And this is something that I think the regulators really can focus on productively. And that has to do with basically good laboratory practices of the evolution of models and record keeping on the evolution of those models. So exactly how the model features were selected from search over a huge data set. I mean, how did they pick the features that they're relying on? What were the criteria that were used to add features to the model? Is there a record of the development of the firm's key models, their evolution and performance tracking? What exactly were the developmental steps in devising those models to the current state? Who was responsible for those steps? And then not all the institutions, in fact, the preponderance of financial institutions are using vendor models. So the same need for governance and record keeping applies to vendor models. And I think, again, this isn't something necessarily that's done. With the vendor model, is there a log of the actual use of the vendor model? Are the dashboard settings recorded and the outcomes over time, giving the dashboard settings of vendor models? Who has access to these settings? And I think here it's an opportunity for using new technologies, perhaps using blockchain technology, that actually gives us a very clear lineage of the steps that are taking in developing these models or the use of these models. And this was a big problem even with the simple credit scoring models that were used long ago, let's say 2006 and 7, where that record keeping simply was never done. And then I think there needs to be clear metrics about the rank orderings of the risks for maximum harm from some of these models. And the expectations for explainability from those that are considered to be higher risk need to be exact. And maybe something akin to sensitivity analyses could be required for lesser risk models. Right now, I don't think that hierarchy of risk is as precisely defined as it could be by regulators. And then lastly, do the firms have good metrics to measure risk return trade-off for incremental changes in their models? So it may improve the prediction in some dimension, but it also may expose the firm to more risk and from the change. And again, I think good governance over this model development process and model use and maintenance process is really important in terms of having transparency from the regulator's standpoint.
Thank you. So we've been talking about explainability and about sort of record keeping to help with explainability. Patrice, I'm going to ask you to explain a little bit more, how does the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning tools without appropriate understanding by industry users, how might that create risk to consumers? You know, following up on what Nancy was saying, do you feel like the regulators are now taking steps to implement these kind of suggestions and to make sure that the predictions are not so difficult to understand and interpret?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, Irina. And just, you know, in a nutshell, an absence of transparency, explainability, interpretability indeed does create risks to consumers. And I'll just note that a key consideration for any technique that a financial services provider uses is to ensure the model's transparency and explainability, because those essential qualities actually help the financial institution and others understand how those models function, not only at implementation, but as importantly over time. And so that gets to Nancy's very powerful point about model governance and the importance of sound model governance. Understanding the conceptual soundness of any model, tool, application, or system aids in managing its risks, including those risks related to the lack of explainability. And the importance of conceptual soundness is described in existing agency guidance and is well established in industry practice. For traditional approaches to credit underwriting, conceptual soundness is foundational to both the development as well as the validation and independent review of models. In the case of certain less transparent AI approaches, however, evaluations of conceptual soundness can be complicated. The underlying theory and logic may be less accessible to users than that of traditional approaches or more transparent AI approaches. But without insight into an approach's general operating principles, a financial institution management team cannot evaluate with confidence how the system will function in unforeseen circumstances. In this vein, one critical issue is how complex AI ML models address the adverse action notice requirements that are contained in the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And we call those ECOA and FCRA. Those are two consumer protection laws that the Bureau enforces. And for those who are not familiar with those laws, I'll note that the ECOA requires creditors to provide consumers with the main reasons for a denial of credit or other adverse action. And FCRA requires that when an adverse action is based in whole or in part on a credit score obtained from a consumer reporting agency, creditors have to disclose the key factors that adversely affected that credit score, along with the name and contact information of the CRA and additional content that are required under the law and regulation. These two laws contain important legal requirements that are intended to serve multiple purposes, which are both consumer-facing and regulator-facing. With regard to the consumer-facing reasons, adverse action notices are educational in that they notify consumers about potential inaccuracies about how they may improve their chances of being approved for credit in the future. And the regulator-facing reasons are that adverse action notices can help regulators identify possible areas of fair lending risks. And so a key question that many are grappling with is how to ensure that adverse action notices that are given with regard to the outputs that are generated by AI ML models, can they be delivered in a way that's both accurate and also understandable and intelligible for the average consumer? In August of last year, the CFPB issued a request for comment on various topics related to the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, or the ECOA. And one portion of that request for information focused on AI ML. We specifically said, financial institutions are starting to deploy artificial intelligence and machine learning across a range of functions. For example, they're used as virtual assistants that can fulfill customer requests, in models to detect fraud or other potential illegal activity, as compliance monitoring tools, and in credit underwriting. And we asked the question, should the Bureau provide more regulatory clarity under ECOA or its implementing regulation, Reg B, to help facilitate innovation in a way that increases access to credit for consumers and communities without unlawful discrimination? We also noted in that same RFI that there may be questions about how institutions can comply with adverse action notice requirements if the reasons driving an AI ML decision are based on complex interrelationships. And we went on to ask whether the Bureau should modify the requirements or existing guidance concerning adverse action notices under ECOA in order to better empower consumers to make more informed financial decisions and or to provide additional clarity when underwriting decisions are based in part on AI ML models. As I previously mentioned, we recently joined with 5 of our sister financial regulatory agencies to issue the RFI that closes on July 1st. And in that, we also noted the importance of thinking about adverse action notice requirements as well. And I'll say that the CFPB plans to use the information gathered from our own RFI, as well as the currently pending RFI, in order to assist in determining whether any clarifications would be helpful for financial institutions as they use AI, hopefully, expectedly, in compliance with applicable laws and regulations. The last thing I'll note is that we also launched our very first tech sprint in October of last year, and we focused it on adverse action notices. And for those who aren't familiar with tech sprints, what they do is they actually are events, sometimes known as hackathons, but we thought it unwise for a federal regulator to host something called a hackathon, so we dubbed it a tech sprint, taking a page from Great Britain's Financial Conduct Authority. And this tech sprint actually brought together a variety of stakeholders for a week-long collaboration around thinking about adverse action notice requirements and ways that those can be improved to actually be more helpful to consumers as well as regulators. And there were several teams that participated in that tech sprint that focused specifically on developing possible ways to address adverse action notice requirements in the context of AI ML-driven decisioning. So that's just a little kind of high-level review of some of the things that we're thinking about in terms of both the substantive risks of discrimination as well as compliance with the adverse action notice requirements in this very technical and complex but highly important area of AI ML models. Thank you.
So that's another area that's sort of ripe for innovation. It sounds like how to make models compliant, how to make them more fair, how to make sure that they're protecting user privacy.
Yes, and can I just interject one other thought, Irina, which is you had mentioned earlier this point about privacy, and I did just want to speak just for a moment about privacy because it's interesting. Title 10 of the Dodd-Frank Act, which established the CFPB, In Section 1033 of that title, the Bureau is given actually a very important responsibility that relates to this privacy issue and also relates to some of the issues about data that both Nancy and Aaron have raised. What the Bureau is called upon to do is to actually address this notion of consumers' ownership and control over their data. And that's a really important issue now, as many of us are engaging in activities that, the average person may not realize may actually have ramifications for how they're treated in a credit underwriting process. And so as institutions monetize and leverage what one might call digital exhaust, right? What websites Patrice accesses, or, who her friends are on Facebook, there is this whole question about financial consumer data, period, including financial account data, how those data are accessed, transmitted, stored, and used by financial institutions, and what rights and opportunities do consumers have in this context. And so Section 1033 of the Dodd-Frank Act requires the Bureau to actually promulgate rules around how financial institutions would make available upon consumers' requests. So this is, permission driven, right? Transaction data or other information concerning a consumer financial product or service. And so we're in the process of evaluating the information that we've gathered through a symposium that we hosted last year on consumer authorized financial data sharing. And we also last year issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking asking for comments around consumer data access. And we've received those comments and are in the process of considering how to promulgate that rule. But I just think it's an important place where, while the Bureau really, doesn't have under its jurisdiction specific privacy laws, there are implications and there are ways in which our authority does touch consumer privacy. And this is one key way in which it does as well. So I just thought I would flag that in response to the point you made earlier.
Absolutely, and we see more and more laws impacting the kind of privacy streams that you're talking about as well. I think we need a different metaphor. We need to stop calling it data exhaust. That kind of minimizes its impact and its usefulness and its value, right? So Nancy, I'm going to ask you, and you might be muted, you might need to unmute yourself. If banking industry users purchase algorithms for loan decision making from third parties, they're not developing their own, what might they require in terms of algorithmic audits pre-purchase? And can you just talk a little bit about this, new focus on algorithmic audits in general?
Yes, it's a great question, and I think it really hasn't been explored enough by regulators. And even in the Dodd-Frank process, I don't think there's enough focus on the difference in performance of institutions that are using vendor models and those that are using their internal models. Because for the internal model, as I said, you can have governance processes that can be appraised, evaluated, and updated over time. But that's much more difficult with the vendor models because they're proprietary usually. They're often shielded in this veil of proprietary features that are difficult to force the companies to reveal. And so the users of these models they're subject to the negative outcomes potentially from the use of their model without very good control over why those negative outcomes are happening. And that's where I get back to what I recommended before. I think it's twofold. Yes, there should be an audit, but it's also how they're used within the firms that are reliant on vendor models. In that, I think it can be very haphazard how these models are applied. And the same need for governance in terms of how do you use the dashboards, what events in the macroeconomy lead you to change anything on the dashboards in terms of your forecasting. All of that needs to be recorded, and there need to be expectations from firms that use these models to record those activities. Because otherwise, again, you're underwriting to a model, and the models will cease to be predictive. And especially as we go into where we are currently in the business cycle, that has a lot of risks because the models, we see sign switching on some of the key variables like FICO scores. and other negative outcomes in terms of over-reliance on a very limited set of variables that are within the scope, especially of the vendor models.
Thank you. And we're seeing now also growing concern that even the audits, which are so important, might be co-opted by the vendors. So the definition of what constitutes an audit is now becoming a hot topic of conversation, and no standards have been developed yet around that. I want to remind everybody that we're starting to take your questions, so we're going to switch to that in a minute. I just have a couple of quick ones of my own to get through. One is to Erin, since we're talking about broadly ethical issues related to the use of AI and ML, and one that's not discussed enough is just the use of energy, the sustainability questions related to the use of such models and trained on such vast amounts of data. So I'm wondering, Erin, as it embraces AI and ML as part of its services, can the banking industry play a role in the push for green AI?
So I am actually not so worried about the energy use of machine learning. I think, although there are some real issues there, I think by and large it is overstated. So it is true that when you train these enormous language models that Google and OpenAI do, things that you might have read about in the news with names like GPT-3, these are really power intensive. This takes a lot of energy. But even at companies like Google, like the fraction of their energy usage that is spent on training enormous models like this is some tiny fraction of their overall energy consumption. And for the kinds of models that you might plausibly use to help you make credit decisions, although maybe they are sort of non-trivial in terms of their energy usage when you train them, mostly you're not training them. Mostly you are using them. And this has very limited energy usage. It's much the intensive thing is sort of the thing you do rarely, which is training these models on large data, but actually using them to make decisions is relatively cheap from an energy perspective. And so I don't know the numbers, but I would be shocked if there was any financial institution for whom, if you looked at their overall energy usage, that like deploying machine learning models came, even showed up on the list. Like this is, perhaps an issue to deal with eventually, but it is like issue number 58 when we're talking about the problems that might arise when deploying machine learning models. Like switching to LED lights would in your office building would like save you 10 times more energy than worrying about this, at least at the moment.
Thank you. I think I wonder also if we're talking, what came up earlier was the notion of ongoing or continuous retraining, the need to make sure and check and retrain. So that might add to this as well. But I appreciate that on that ranking of concerns, this might still be lower than many others. So to go back to our main concerns, I'm going to just ask Patrice, do you feel optimistic that AI and ML can be used in ways that would actually increase access to banking services and improve banking services in general? And obviously, that's the promise part that we're talking about in all of these webinars, and that most of the people working on this are trying to make things better. Do you feel like this is actually moving us in that direction, or are you more concerned about these tools risking leaving further behind those who are already marginalized?
I think it's a great question, Irina, and I think in some ways it's kind of the money question, so to speak, and that it's sort of a pun and sort of not, right, for us as federal regulators. And I guess, the notion of new products and services being couched as innovation is something that I can remember in the years leading up to the Great Recession. That term innovative was used to describe mortgage loan products that actually turned out to be, really problematic for consumers. And so when you think about the ways in which pick-a-pay mortgages, for example, were marketed as affordability tools, when they had actually started out as being, the types of products that would provide flexibility for high net worth borrowers. I mean, that's the type of sort of way in which the notion of innovation can potentially be transmogrified into something that actually is not ultimately, beneficial to consumers. And so I think that question, is still present with us now. And I'll just note just a couple of things in response to that. Let me first talk for just a moment about compliance, and then I'll talk for a moment about kind of more of the credit underwriting context. In terms of fair lending compliance, one of the areas that is very interesting to us is the fact that machine learning may actually provide a way to actually improve some key aspects of kind of core fair lending compliance. And by that I mean, at the beginning, Nancy talked a little bit about the disparate impact standard on the Fair Housing Act. Under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, not only do we assess the purported legitimate business need of a particular model or a practice or policy that is creating adverse impact, but there's also a third prong of the analysis that requires an assessment of, even if you can establish a legitimate business need, which is again the ECOA standard, there's a question around whether or not there's a less discriminatory alternative. In other words, is there an alternative specification of this model that actually would still provide sufficient predictive lift, or whatever the objective is, whether it's prediction of default or whatever for the model, but also minimize adverse impact or disparities, fair lending risk, right? And today, most of that type of alternatives testing, as we call it, is done manually. And so if you think about the fact that a statistician, an analyst, an economist could sit and spend a 40-hour work week, trying to sort of, pull out certain variables or reweight them to try to identify less discriminatory alternatives, one could readily think of what the limits would be of what the output would be. In other words, how many alternatives a human could potentially explore in a 40-hour work week. Well, if a machine learning model, compliance model, a challenger model, as they're sometimes called, can be created to actually challenge a production model. And this is an aspect of, compliance management, right? To challenge a production model to see whether or not a less discriminatory alternative can be identified. A machine learning compliance model can actually evaluate millions of combinations in a relatively small period of time. And again, I'll set aside the whole question of electricity, these models versus LED lights, because I don't want to be viewed as ungreen. I'm actually quite green. But in a much shorter time period, and it can actually, since be programmed to optimize for those two qualities. So we definitely do see promise in the compliance side. In terms of the credit underwriting side, I think, one of the most important issues that the Bureau has focused on is one that we've dubbed credit invisibles, right? And it's those folks, our fellow residents here in the United States who are thin or no file in terms of their scoreability, and who, for those reasons are often not part of sort of the mainstream in terms of credit, and there are other implications in being unscorable, not just even outside of the credit context. And so there is this question around whether or not these technologies, these new ways of underwriting and evaluating credit risk, could actually help historically marginalized communities that are disproportionately credit invisible or unscorable, and may perhaps promote the availability of credit that is lower cost and more available, mainstream credit, than they would have otherwise through the use of AI/ML. But there's also the risk, as we've talked about earlier, that AI/ML could actually be a very sophisticated way of calcifying current inequities and perhaps in some instances exacerbating them. And Nancy touched on this earlier, but when we think about granular and sophisticated pricing, innovations actually may shift what we used to think of as prime credit as it gets sliced up into many pieces, each of which is priced differently. And that type of granular evaluation might mean that underserved and vulnerable consumers actually end up paying more. And so, really, I think in many ways we're still very much evaluating these changes, these developments, and they are so complex that we're spending a lot of time learning. It's really, really important for us to understand what the potential benefits and risks are in this space so that we can intelligently regulate and provide guidance in this space. And I have to say that sometimes when I finished a couple of hours of deliberations and debates about, some of these AI/ML and I listen to people who speak in the language that Erin and Nancy speak in, sometimes I personally have to go take some Advil because these things are really challenging. It's really complex, but hugely important. And so while there are certain principles that I think we've agreed upon in terms of interpretability, transparency, explainability, but in terms of really being able to provide what regulators need to provide in a sophisticated way, in a nuanced way, that tries to, in a sense, preserve the baby and dispense with the bathwater, or take advantage of the promise but not the perils. That's part of the reason for the RFI that I've mentioned a couple of times here, right? Is to help us understand how we need to move forward in this space. One of the last things I'll mention, though, is that I had the honor of joining with our sister agencies in work on a statement on alternative data. And I'm proud that we developed it over the course of a year because, as some of you may know who are insiders, an interagency joint statement that is developed in less than the elephant gestation period is a victory. And so a 12-month gestation period yielded an interagency statement on alternative data where we talked a little bit about some of the places where there may be promise with regard to cash flow underwriting, for example, with appropriate risk management and other types of considerations, and also noted that other types of data that have a more attenuated connection to how a borrower goes about repaying debt obligations raise more risk and much more scrutiny. And so that's sort of an early kind of first step in terms of guidance in this space. But again, I think it underscores the complexity and the importance of these developments and the role that we will play as federal financial services regulators in trying to ensure that we chart a prudent path with regard to these issues. So thank you. Thanks for the question.
Thanks. And I'm just smiling, thinking that, other people probably take Advil after hearing about all the legal ramifications and the governance issues as well. So we have some questions from the audience. The first one is for Erin. Erin, you mentioned the challenge of preserving privacy about individuals who make up the training data. Can you please expand a little on that? And are there best practices?
Sure. So sort of a common first reaction when you think about individual privacy is maybe simply the act of aggregating, not publishing the data set, but just averages or something, more obscure. A deep neural network trained on the data set should somehow protect privacy just sort of by virtue of its complexity or something. And so first of all, that's not true. So what we sort of know through a couple of decades of research on things with names like membership attacks and re-identification attacks, basically aimed at extracting individual data from statistical estimates and trained machine learning models, is that this is very possible. So for example, machine learning models are trained on a particular data set that has some particular individuals in it and does not have others, and then it's deployed on other data, and the hope is that if the data it was trained on is similar, at least in some distributional sense, to the data it's deployed on, it'll behave well there. But nevertheless, these models are substantially more accurate and more confident on the data they were trained on. So this is something that a clever attacker can use to distinguish between data points that were available at training and those that were not. And so, for example, if you think about a medical application where I have trained on data from patients that have some particular disease, say, because I'm training a diagnostic tool for that disease, if I can determine, if some external party can determine that you were in the training data, which with standard models they typically can, that is disclosive that you were in the patient population that had this disease. So this is all to say that it's sort of, when thinking about privacy, it's tempting to think that if you're releasing something complicated, you don't have to worry about privacy. If I'm just releasing aggregate statistics or trained models, you don't have to worry about privacy, but that's not true. Now, there are approaches, there are sort of relatively recent approaches in the last 15 or 20 years that allow you to extract statistical information in ways that are protective of privacy in strong ways. So there's something called differential privacy. Let me briefly explain what it is, both to answer the question and also to just give an example of something that is true across everything we've been talking about today, fairness, privacy, explainability, of the importance of thinking carefully what you mean by an English word like privacy when you start trying to build it into technical systems. So what should privacy mean? So differential privacy takes the following philosophical premise and makes it formal. It says, suppose I did some statistical analysis or trained some machine learning model on data that you were not a part of, right? I allowed you to go in and scrub your own data before I trained the model, or maybe we're even imagining that this is happening in some alternative universe in which you were never born. Okay. In that case, in this like idealized world, you should not think of your privacy as having been violated. I might have learned statistical facts about the world that allow me to infer things about you. For example, I might have learned that smoking and lung cancer are correlated, and then if I see that you're a smoker, I now know that you're at elevated risk of lung cancer. But you shouldn't think of that as a privacy violation because it's not something I learned from your data, right? And somehow the statistical correlation between smoking and lung cancer was not your secret to keep. Okay, that's sort of the starting philosophical stance of differential privacy. And then what differential privacy asks for, if I say I've trained some machine learning model subject to differential privacy, what that means is that no outside observer should be able to distinguish better than random guessing whether the model I've actually trained and deployed was trained from your data or was trained in this sort of hypothetical idealized world in which your data was not present at all. And the idea is that, well, if you buy into the premise that in this idealized world in which your data wasn't available, that your privacy was protected, then you should also be happy with the privacy properties of the model we've deployed, because you can't tell, nobody can tell better than random guessing whether we were in this perfectly private world or not. And so at a high level, that's what differential privacy is. And there's a large, both for many years just in academic literature, trying to think about how to solve various kinds of statistical inference tasks and other ways to gain value from large data sets subject to these protections. And in the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen this turn into an actual practical technology that is now widely deployed both in tech and at least in a few months when the census releases the statistical products as part of the 2020 decennial census, also deployed in government.
Thank you. So another question I think is for any of you who are interested in taking it, and it talks about population size, but the fact that banks and other financial use cases are global. Global population, the questioner mentions, global population distributions are different from local ones. For instance, whites are currently majority in the USA, but are not globally and soon will not be in the USA. So the term minority is relative. Shouldn't regulations around fairness metrics and data sourcing for fairness consider this relative nature or minority by majority? Would any of this calculus changed if, let's say, again, whites were the minority? Would we then just worry similarly about, disparate impact on whatever the minority group is?
So I can make a brief comment and then turn it over to the real experts. So I think, clearly, when you think about what are the demographic groups that for which it's important to protect, that is context dependent. If I am deploying a lending algorithm in the United States, I will be worried about discrimination along very different lines than if I am deploying it in India, for example. And so, sort of when you think about this first step of precisely specifying what are the fairness properties you actually want your model to satisfy, often that first step involves thinking, who are the groups that you are worried about discrimination against? Oftentimes this requires thinking in the context of historical discrimination in the area that you are deploying your model, and this will be different in different parts of the world. It's different in the US compared to India, compared to China. But I think the underlying methodology and technologies that are developed that sort of say, well, first think about who are the groups you want to protect, think about what are the decisions that the model might make that are harmful, and now let's think about making sure that those aren't disproportionately focused in any one group. These are sort of generalizable ways of thinking. And of course, regulations, to the extent that they talk about particular groups, have to be embedded in the context of the society in which they are enacted. Yeah, now I'll turn it over to the experts.
I appreciate that. Patrice or Nancy, do you want to tackle that? Oh, Nancy, I think you're muted. Sorry.
I agree with what Erin just said. Obviously, there's a super important temporal component to these models, and the evolution of populations in the United States are ever changing. That said, the basic structure of the demographics in the United States is changing very slowly, and it's geographically less dynamic than you might suppose. So I think another dimension of these models that hasn't been mentioned is that economists are worried about pricing. I mean, a lot of the banking effort is about pricing. And so they're trying to get models that have policy variables that are also varying. And so for that, you need a long time series. So things like interest rates, house prices. And so there's a tension in building these models between matching policy variables that are considered treatment variables on ex post behavior and demographics, which are evolving in different ways. And that tension in building these models is true in the United States, and it's absolutely true internationally. And I don't think, at least my experience is, you would not use the models you develop in the United States in other countries. And oftentimes you wouldn't even use a model that you developed in California for, say, another state on the East Coast. I mean, segmenting these populations is a very important feature of what's going on in terms of understanding pricing.
And to Patrice's earlier point, is this an issue that was always with us, that's not
Yes.
particular to AI/ML, but to any kind of consideration of setting rates and looking into
The pricing
future,
problem
watching the past?
requires long time series because you're fitting interest rate dynamics. Just think right now we've been at the zero lower bound for 10 years. So we're in a world where house prices are rising rapidly and interest rates are close to zero. So 10 years of data are contaminated or a feature of basically one policy variable. And so forecasting out of sample, even though there are lots and lots of demographic dynamics going on, the treatment variables are not as predominant in the data. And that's a big problem for people that are not just scoring, but also pricing the credit.
And I'll just note in response to this question that I think that it is helpful to sort of, for federal regulators to really just kind of note the dynamics and the changes in our societies. We know that the United States geographically is still very, very segregated. So for example, the law does not allow the collection of race and demographic data in most aspects of credit transactions. But for mortgage lending, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, or HMDA as we call it, requires the collection and reporting of those demographic data. And the Bureau is currently working to promulgate a rule that would require similar data collection and reporting for small business lending. But outside of those areas, we actually have to proxy for race and ethnicity and gender sometimes as well in terms of doing our analytics. And it's kind of sad to say that the predictive power of proxy methods is often derived from the highly segregated, particularly when you get down to census tract, nature of our neighborhoods here in the U.S. I'll just observe, though, that there are some interesting things that are developing with regard to thinking about race and ethnicity. in some of the analyses that I've seen in recent years, I'm seeing that the category of folks who are mixed race is increasing as a category that is analyzed, in some of the work that the Bureau does. And I'll also just point out that in the 2015 amendments to the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, we required a collection of disaggregated data, right? So rather than treating the population of Asian borrowers or the population of Latinx or Hispanic borrowers as a monolith, the law was changed, and this is in the mortgage lending context only, but the law was changed to actually require the collection and reporting of where voluntarily provided by consumers of disaggregated data. So what subtype of the Hispanic or Latinx ethnicity or of the Asian race category, and recognizing that sometimes subgroups can have very different experiences with the financial services system than others. And I think many are probably familiar with examples of how different subgroups within the Asian or the Hispanic Latinx groupings may have very different experiences, very different levels of wealth, and access to a lot of the things that actually help build wealth in this country. So part of the thinking behind the disaggregated collection of those data is to try to shine a light, on those areas. I think, though, one of the challenges, and this gets to Erin's much earlier point about intersectionality, is that when it comes to empirical work, sometimes the sample sizes get too small to allow meaningful comparisons with statistical confidence when you really start to slice. I think he gave an example of African American women, for example, as an intersectional group that might have different experiences than Blacks as a whole or than women as a whole. But I do think there is sort of a pragmatic challenge, but interesting data nonetheless, perhaps for policymaking purposes. I think when it comes to the methodological side of things, though, it can present some problems. So anyway, just some observations.
Yeah, no.
If I can just jump in to make a small point, since it came up and since we have regulators on the line, these regulations that prevent financial institutions from collecting demographic data, although I'm sure very well intentioned when they were put into practice, I think are extremely counterproductive when it comes to training and auditing machine learning models for things like racial or gender bias, because it makes it difficult to even measure these concrete error disparities that we've been talking about, let alone correct for them. And so I think that one thing that has sort of been realized in the academic study of fairness in machine learning over the last decade is that although it's tempting to sort of regulate, to try to get at fairness by limiting inputs to the algorithm, by sort of thinking about what the algorithm should or should not be able to see, it's not an effective way of doing things. It's much more effective to think about what properties you want the algorithm to actually have when deployed, the outputs of the algorithm, and being able to have things like features about whether someone is in a protected group is important in order to be able to enforce constraints, for example, that our models do not make mistakes in the harmful direction, disproportionately on one group over another.
Yeah, no, this is a fantastic point. And if you're interested in submitting this as part of a response to our RFI, I would welcome it. But let me play it back the way that it's been communicated to me, because I've heard this from multiple sources. And interestingly enough, some civil rights groups have actually been pressing the Bureau to address this issue in order to facilitate opportunities to explicitly use demographic data in model debiasing efforts. And so that's how it's been articulated to us over the past, I guess I'd say maybe year, that I've been hearing this exact same point. But would certainly welcome your more formal comments as well, Erin.
Sure.
And there have definitely been calls, and I think some proposals also for harmonizing the current laws with the needs of the machine learning community that's trying to, debias. And that takes us to another question from the audience, which is maybe directed at Erin. What are your thoughts on model build approaches that attempt to minimize disparate impact during the model build process?
Some of them are good ideas. So I mean, that's a very broad category of things, but if I think it is important to, in the model training process, enforce as explicit constraints the things that you want your eventually deployed model to satisfy, which may well be things like rough error rate balance across demographic groups. And the right time to do that is at model training. There are ways to do it post hoc. You can sort of try to modify the decisions of the model after the fact, but those are wasteful. Those are just not as good in terms of either the performance of the model or in these sort of fairness metrics as if you had been able to incorporate them directly into the training process. So it's not a substitute for being careful about data gathering. You'll always be limited by your data, but neither is careful data curation a substitute for thinking about what you want out of your model at the moment at which you're training it.
I think we have time for one more question, which is about the kind of risk we've been talking about. And the question is basically, if the analysis is solely based, let's say, on things like social media follower counts or engagement behaviors or interests, not protected class criteria or demographics or region, what level of risk do you think this is introducing for potential non-compliance with fair lending? Patrice, do you see, so if it doesn't, if it's assessing, or if the alternate additional data are things like social media behaviors or or other interests determined from your online behavior, are you concerned that that would be potentially impacting the compliance side?
Yes, thank you. My husband just stuck his head in to say hello, so I'm so sorry. It's one of the challenges of this remote working environment. So thank you for cueing me yet again. Yes, actually, there are some potential risks for both consumers and lenders with regard to alternative data. And as we think about behavioral data, I think particularly are problematic as a category. And also sort of broader data that actually attribute certain potential outcomes to consumers based on sort of broader activities in which they engage. And I think that the way I would characterize those potential risks are with regard to, as we talked about earlier, privacy, data quality issues. When we think about who's out there sort of making sure that these data that are being aggregated are in fact accurate. And what are the methods by which a consumer can dispute and correct these types of data? There's not sort of an infrastructure like there is with regard to traditional credit reports for disputing and correcting inaccuracies in those data, or even just awareness of the type of data that are collected. A loss of transparency. I talked earlier about a loss of control by consumers, as well as challenges with regard to consumer education. I mean, this is an area that is quite complex. And very few people really understand AI ML models. I've had some conversations with some people who seem to understand it, but the further you dig, the more you realize they actually really don't understand these issues. And so, how can we help consumers understand what's going on and how behavior that they might not think is related to credit underwriting, in fact, can have an effect on that. And also unintended consequences and the legal concerns that I've spoken about earlier. And so just in terms of thinking about those consumer risks, I think there's a panoply of consumer risks. And at the end of the day, thinking about not only how do we, in a sense, intelligently regulate in this space, but how do we also equip consumers to advocate for themselves and to understand what's going on and how they can actually improve their lives. And there's a lot of talk these days about by the Biden administration, for example, about racial inequity and wealth building opportunities for vulnerable consumers, rural, underserved, minority consumers, and part of that success is really premised on consumer understanding and empowerment. And I think that AI/ML presents a very significant challenge with regard to consumer understanding and empowerment, and is yet another area of the Bureau's focus, and I know the focus of our sister agencies as well.
So I think that also brings us to the fact that legal compliance is not the end all, and that ethics goes beyond legal compliance. Ethics talks about human flourishing. And to your point, if we really want humanity to flourish, how can we make sure that these tools actually lead in that direction, and not just that they're, basically compliant with current regulations, which, as we are hearing, are changing as well. So I want to thank our panelists so much. I think this panel really demonstrated the complexities of this topic and the fact that it requires multidisciplinary, approaches and intersections and very different perspectives because of its complexity. Just want to thank all of you who joined us today for joining. Please remember to save the date of Thursday, September 16, for the next webinar session in this series, which will be on open banking. Today's webinar was recorded and will be posted on the event website within a few weeks, and previous webinar recordings can also be viewed on the event website. Thank you again to the panelists. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I think we all learned a lot.
Thanks for having us.